recorded. Yep, and let me begin. So good morning, Holly. Good afternoon to all Lafayette students. So I'll introduce our speaker now. So Holly Engstrom is a fifth-year PhD student, social psychologist at the University of British Columbia in the Magic Lab, directed by Professor Kristen Lauren. Her research focuses on social justice and inequality, primarily investigating social class differences, psychological outcomes. Holly also has research interests and projects related to gender, morality, and politics. And fun fact, we met as Holly was my mentor for UBC program, like mentorship program for prospective grad students. And so from now on, please, Holly, take it away. And once again, warm welcome at Lafayette, though virtually.
Thank you so much. Can you guys all hear me? Is it working? Awesome. Yeah, thank you all so much for inviting me. I'm really excited to talk to you about a couple of the projects that I've been doing during my PhD here at UBC. So bear with me because I'm going to live out high school me's dream of giving a whole talk based on this show, The OC, which was totally my favorite show in high school. I don't know if you guys have seen this, but if you like ridiculous drama actors who are clearly in their 30s or 40s playing high school students, definitely recommend. Don't worry, it's also going to be relevant to the research that I present. So, and the way that it's relevant is that the OC, which is the Orange County in LA, is a really wealthy area. And then a key conflict on this TV show is this character, Ryan Atwood, who's from a more low-income area of town. And a wealthy family who lives in the OC agrees to kind of take him in. And so a major source of conflict for the early parts of the show is the social class differences between Ryan and the other people in the town who come from money. So for example, there's this rich kid, Luke Ward. And right away when they meet, I think it's like episode 1, they get into an argument. And Ryan says this iconic line, "You know what I like about rich kids?" You can probably guess where that's going, but he then obviously punches Luke in the face and says nothing. So we know from this show and from our lives and experiences that social class shapes the way that people live their lives and experience different outcomes. So for example, Ryan grew up in poverty in an area of town with worse schools, less access to healthy food, higher crime, whereas Luke grows up in this fancy house with great private schools his parents can afford, whatever food he wants, low crime, little danger. And of course, these factors have powerful material consequences for people's health, for people's future prospects in terms of education and careers and so on. But what about the social consequences of social class? And I think this show actually does a pretty nice job of illustrating the idea that social class can also shape our social outcomes. So for example, here, when these rich ladies are meeting Ryan's mother for the first time, it's pretty clear from their faces that they're judging her based on her social class background. And so this is the question that has shaped a lot of my PhD research. So how does social class influence the way we interact with one another and the way that we think about those interactions? So today I'm going to tell you about 3 different research projects that relate to this idea of the social consequences of social class. I'm going to start with trust in other people. And then I'll be moving to talking about expectations for how others view us. And then finally, I'll talk about some responses to negative social events. So first, in terms of trust, this research project kind of started out with us asking, how do people choose which strangers to trust? And we think it's going to depend on how people weigh the answers to 2 questions. So first, is this the kind of person who would honor my trust? And second, is this person in a situation where they'd be tempted to betray my trust? And I think social class influences people's answers to both these questions because social class is associated with a whole bunch of stereotypes that might affect how you answer those 2 questions. So if we care most about who's the kind of person who would honor our trust, we might want to think about who's a good moral person versus who do we think is not a good moral person. And social class stereotypes likely influence our answer to that question. So people often stereotype upper class people as being kind of cold or maybe even evil. So like Luke here in the first episode tries to beat up Ryan literally just because he grew up poor. Like it's pretty immoral. In contrast, people tend to associate low or middle social class with higher warmth and morality. So from the very first episode, this guy Ryan, he's really just a kind of kind and decent person trying to get through life with what he has. And we find this pattern in our data as well. So if we ask people what they think of someone who's upper class versus when they imagine someone who's lower class, they tend to rate the lower class person as being quite a bit more moral compared to the upper class person. So for example, and I think it would make sense if you thought someone who's really moral would also be more likely to honor your trust and less likely to betray you, right? So for example, you might think that Luke's the type who wouldn't really care about you. So if you ask him to, let's say, like watch your laptop while you go to the bathroom, Luke might just kind of walk away and leave your laptop sitting there. Whereas Ryan seems like a nice, honest guy. He'd probably watch it carefully. So in other words, this research on stereotypes suggests that if we focus on this first question, people will be more likely to trust lower class individuals compared to upper class individuals because they are stereotyping lower class people as more moral and therefore more likely to maybe honor their trust, less likely to betray it. But we might also consider who's in a situation that might tempt them to betray us. So since people know that upper class folks have tons of resources, they might expect them to be better able to kind of honor and repay their trust. Whereas they might expect lower class people would be in need or maybe even desperate and therefore be more tempted to betray them. So for example, you might think, look, lives in this giant mansion. He has no reason at all to steal your laptop. Like he probably has an entire laptop room just full of them. Whereas Ryan, who comes from this impoverished background, might have a bigger need for something like your laptop. So he might be more tempted to betray your trust. And we tested this empirically as well. So when we asked people to imagine upper and lower class people, they reported that they thought the upper class person would be less likely to have a situation that would tempt them to steal, lie, or cheat, do kind of immoral things in general, compared to someone like Ryan, who maybe has more of that temptation. So in other words, if we focus on this second question, the prediction is that people will be more likely to trust upper class people compared to lower class ones, because they think that lower class people's situation might tempt them to betray their trust. So to test these predictions, we ran 3 pre-registered studies using this economic game, which is called the trust game. So in this game, the truster starts with some amount of resources, let's say $10, and then the trustee starts with nothing. So they can decide to give any amount of their resources to the trustee. And after they do that, the money gets tripled. So if they give all $10 to their trustee, the trustee would actually get $30. And then the trustee can decide to return any amount of that $30 back to the truster. So if you really trust your partner, you should give them the whole $10, right? Because they'll get 30, they'll probably split it evenly with you, and then you'll both end up richer than when you started. But if you don't trust them, you shouldn't give them anything because they can just keep whatever they give you, whatever you give them. They don't have to give anything back to you. So in every study, our participants are always the truster, and they play with 2 different people who they thought were in the lab with them, but actually were fake. So one was lower class and one was from an upper class background. So these studies are all within subjects. So in study 1, we had 200 undergrad students come into the lab and they filled out a profile about themselves. And then they read profiles that were supposedly from people in the cubicles next to them who they'd be playing the game with. And these profiles had some neutral information as filler and then a couple of hints about the target's social class. So for example, in one of these hints, the lower class target said their dad worked in construction, mom worked at a daycare, whereas the upper class target said their dad's a software engineer and mom's a corporate lawyer. As another hint, the lower class target said they couldn't really go anywhere over the winter break since they had to work, so they just hung out with their cousins. Whereas the upper class target also stated their cousins, but they did it at their vacation home in Italy. And then we also included a third control target where we didn't provide any information about social class. So once participants read those profiles, they learned about the trust game using the same instructions I told you about earlier, but they learned that they'd be playing for raffle tickets, and the raffle was for a $100 Amazon gift card. So basically, you want to get as many tickets as you can because that'll get you a higher chance of winning the gift card. And the truster starts with 10 raffle tickets and the trustee starts with none. So then to see who participants trust, we compare how many tickets they give to the lower class target, the upper class target, and the control target. So that's what I'm showing you here on the y-axis, the number of tickets that they transfer to each partner. So first, people are giving a little bit over 4 tickets on average to the control target, so a bit under half of their starting amount. And that's pretty similar to the upper class target, so people trust the control target pretty much equally to the upper class person. But this is the comparison that we are especially interested in, right? The lower class target. And you can see that participants actually trusted them more than the control target and more than the upper class target. And it's looking like that's driven by increased trust for that lower class person as opposed to decreased trust for the upper class person because it's looking really similar to the control. We also looked for effects of and interactions with participant social class and didn't find any. So your own social class didn't affect how much you trust or how much you trusted the different targets. It was only the target social class that seemed to influence people's trust. So it looks like people might be more likely to trust Ryan than Luke. And it looks like people are trusting the person they think is a good person over the one who they think might be more tempted to betray them. And we also replicated this pattern in another pre-registered study using a similar method. So far we have pretty consistent evidence people trust lower class targets more than upper class targets. But I think these studies have a few important limitations. So first, the social class manipulation used these profiles, which could be confounded with variables other than social class, right? So maybe people just thought, for example, that this upper class person is kind of a jerk for constantly bragging about how rich his family is. Second, the targets were students at the same university. And I think this is a kind of unique situation to talk about social class, right? So maybe people didn't think of the lower class target as actually being very low in social class because they were attending university. Or maybe people had some kind of special respect for them for trying to pull themselves up by their bootstraps, making it this far. So in this study, we recruited UK adults, so people from England, from Prolific Academic, which is a website people can go on to get paid to take surveys. So in this study, we're not using undergrad students as participants, and they believe that they're interacting with other people who are prolific participants. So they also think that the targets aren't university students. And instead of using the profiles I showed you earlier, we just manipulated really straightforward information that's just purely about social class, so like income. And then as in study 1, we also included a control target with no information provided. And in this study, we just had them play for money instead of raffle tickets. And despite all those changes to the procedure, we found a really similar pattern. So people are trusting the lower class target more so than the control and upper class target. And here people really seem to actually distrust the wealthy person. In this study, we also asked people about the target's perceived morality and perceived situational temptation. So like we thought, like we predicted, people thought that the upper class target was less moral, but also had less temptation from their situation to do immoral things. But only morality predicted trust. So regardless of how much your situation might tempt you to betray someone, people actually seem to pay more attention to what they think about your morality. So it seemed like people tend to distrust the wealthy, placing more trust in people with less money. And it seems like people do this because when deciding who to trust, they care most about considering what kind of person this is, rather than what situation the person is in. So this work shows that we trust others differently depending on their social class because of stereotypes that we hold about people's morality. But now I want to turn to another project where we ask, how do people expect others to view them? So we know now a little bit about how people actually do view others based on their social class, but do people actually expect to be seen in line with those stereotypes? So in other words, in the previous section, we talked about how social class influences perceptions, so how I perceive others. And now we're going to switch gears and talk about meta perceptions, so how social class influences my perception of how others perceive me. And I think this is actually an important question to ask because how we think others view us influences how we act. So for example, if I go into an interview, I think that the interviewer is going to think I'm really smart and skilled. I'm probably going to act more confident and maybe do better in the interview than someone who kind of suspects that the interviewer might doubt their abilities and then acts a bit more nervous and not as self-assured. So why and how might social class influence people's beliefs about how others see them? So one reason might be stereotypes. So from other research on stereotypes and stuff in my own lab as well, we know that people tend to stereotype those with lower class as being more warm compared to those with upper class. So that's similar to what I showed you before because warmth includes traits like being moral and trustworthy. But people also stereotype those with lower class as being less competent compared to those with higher class. So people tend to think wealthy people are smart and capable and so on. And then other research tells us people do often derive their meta perceptions from their stereotypes. So when trying to figure out how someone else might see me, I might think about, well, how do you typically see members of my group? And then assume you'll see me kind of in line with those stereotypes. So if this is true that people do base their meta perceptions on stereotypes, then we'd expect that people from lower versus higher class backgrounds believe others see them as warmer, so in line with that trust stuff I told you about earlier, but less competent in line with that stereotype. Another reason social class might influence meta perceptions is through self-views. So from my research and other people's research, we know that people with higher class backgrounds tend to see themselves more positively. So for example, as social class increases, people are more narcissistic and of higher self-esteem compared to those from lower class backgrounds. And you might expect others to see you similarly to how you see yourself. So if people base their meta perceptions on how they see themselves, we would expect those from lower class backgrounds to expect others to see them generally in a more negative light. So both less warm and less competent than those from higher class backgrounds, because that aligns with how maybe they see themselves. So one more reason social class could influence meta perceptions, I think, is through self-presentation. And this connection isn't as well established in past literature, but one study found that people from lower class backgrounds are less comfortable manipulating others and kind of presenting an overly positive image of themselves. Whereas wealthy people actually seem to think this is sort of fine and even normal and expected. So I think it's likely that people from lower class backgrounds might be less willing to present a really positive, maybe fake seeming image of themselves to others. And it would make sense, of course, that you expect people to see you in line with how you present yourself to those people. So if people do base their meta perceptions on how they expect to present themselves, then we make the same prediction as we did with self-views, that people from lower class backgrounds expect others to see them generally in a more negative light, so both less warm and less competent. So in sum, all three of these mechanisms predict that people from lower class backgrounds will expect others to see them as less competent than people from upper class backgrounds, but they differ in terms of their predictions about warmth. So we've now done so many studies, 16 studies that had measures of social class and meta perceptions. And these studies use a lot of different methods. So we had hypothetical interactions, real online chat conversations, real in-lab conversations. And I will spare you the details of all 16 of these and just show you results from a meta-analysis that we did. So first, if we look at participants' childhood income, so this is if they grew up in a high-income family like Luke or low-income family like Brian, you can see that as we predicted, those who grew up in wealthier families expect others to see them as more competent than those who grew up in less wealthy families. And they also think people see them as more warm, so more likable, honest, sincere than people who grew up in lower income families. So I think this is kind of crazy that these are adults, often in their 30s to 60s, whose parents' income when they were a child predicts how positively they believe other people see them today. We also find the same thing when we look at their current income, the same thing and even more so when we ask people to self-report where they believe they fall in terms of the social class hierarchy. And then it's a little bit different when we look at education, where we don't see any relationship with warmth. But we never see that pattern where lower class individuals are expecting to be seen as more warm than higher class individuals, right? So we never found this pattern predicted by the stereotype mechanism. Even though, like I showed you in the previous project, people actually do seem to stereotype those with lower social classes being at least more moral. Instead, the results seem to support the conclusions from these two mechanisms. So we tested these mechanisms next. So first off, like we thought, self-perceptions, which here is a composite of self-esteem and narcissism, mediates the relationship between social class and meta-perceptions. So what that means is upper class people have more positive views of themselves. So they have higher self-esteem, higher narcissism. And then so that predicts expecting others to see them more positively. And one important thing to note is this doesn't fully explain the relationship between social class and meta-perception. So there's still this significant effect that's kind of left over after accounting for self-perceptions. And this is important, I think, because we were worried at one point, we think we're measuring meta-perceptions, but are we just getting at how people feel about themselves? And I think this suggests that no, we're not just finding a cool new way to study self-esteem. There's actually something more going on here. And I think what that more is self-presentation. So both these mediators have significant and independent indirect effects. So people with high social class see themselves more positively and believe that they'll present a more positive image to others. And then both of those factors predict having more positive beliefs about how others see them. So now we know that social class does predict meta-perceptions. But our next question is kind of how accurate are these? So are lower class individuals right to expect others to see them more negatively? Or maybe are wealthy people being overconfident in their predictions? So to answer this question, we used one of the data sets that was included in that meta-analysis I showed you earlier, collected by our collaborator at McGill University, Lauren Human. So in this study, we had over 500 undergrads come into the lab in small groups of 5 or 6, and then they interact with each other in the round robin design. So it's like a speed dating setup where everyone talks once to every other person. But before they did that, they reported their demographics, including their income. And then after each interaction, they rated how they thought the other person saw them and how they saw the other person. And that rating allows us to then look at how accurate their meta-perceptions actually are. So in other words, how related are my beliefs about someone saw me to how they actually saw me? And if I'm really accurate, there's going to be a strong positive slope between how I think someone saw me and then how they actually did rate me. And what you can see here is most people are generally pretty accurate. So generally, as someone gets perceived more positively, they also think they're perceived more positively, vice versa for the negative traits. But if anyone is less accurate, it's people who grew up in lower income families, as this interaction shows. So this slope is a little bit weaker for those from lower income families. So it doesn't look like it's the wealthy who are overconfident. If anything, it's these people who grew up in lower income families that are actually doubting themselves more than our data suggests that they need to. And we find this similar pattern with household income and personal income. And I think this is interesting because it gives us a clue about one of the consequences of this relationship between social class and meta-perceptions. So for example, in this episode, Ryan is going to a party with his new wealthy family. And if he's right to assume that others see him negatively, then maybe it would actually be a good decision for him to avoid approaching other people and maybe embarrassing himself. But we actually don't find that to be the case. So we find that Ryan has just as good of a shot at making a good impression as someone from a wealthier background. So even though we found that people trusted lower class individuals more because they stereotyped them as more moral, lower class individuals themselves didn't expect that people would see them in line with that stereotype. Instead, they thought people saw them more negatively in terms of both competence and warmth compared to those from higher class backgrounds. So now I'm going to switch gears a little bit from talking about how we see others and expect to be seen by others, and talk instead about how we respond to social events when they occur, and in particular, how we respond to negative social events like conflicts or arguments. So I want to start out talking about this project by reading 2 narratives from our participants about conflicts that they experience in their daily lives. So this is Nina, and she had a conflict with Layla. So she says she's frustrated because Layla was to let me know about a potential get-together in the new year. If the get-together will occur, I need to ask for time off a week in advance. So I told Layla I need to hear from her, but she didn't respond in time, and now it's too late to ask for time off. Obviously, the names are changed. These are my cousins. And then we have Ella, who is also having a conflict with her friend Amy. So she feels upset because Amy treats me as if my problems and worries don't matter. Amy used to treat me really kindly and with care and concern, but things haven't been the same ever since Amy started treating me more coldly and asking me less questions about my concerns. So I think these two are actually pretty similar situations, right? That both people are feeling a little bit snubbed by their friend. But they respond really differently to this snub. So when we asked them what they did in response to this event, Nina spent a ton of time thinking about it. She was worried about resolving it, worried about making sure her friendship was solid, and that her friend would treat her fairly. But Ella kind of brushes off the worry and tries to focus on her exams. So it seems like for Nina, it would have been pretty hard to study after this conflict happened, since she was putting most of her mental energies into dealing with this conflict, right? So the question that I want to ask with this research project is, what are the daily dynamics that we face with our relationships and our goals? And why is it that when some people face a conflict, they can just brush it off and keep focusing on what they're doing, but for others, they're going to focus on resolving that issue, maybe at the expense of their personal goals? Surprise, I think social class probably matters. So a lot of past work has shown that lower class contexts foster more interdependent cultural orientations. So people in lower class contexts tend to grow up with extended family close by, often stay close to home as adults. So they have a smaller circle of more tight-knit connections. And this dense kind of small network of people rely on one another for favors and support. So lower class individuals tend to be more likely to view themselves in terms of their relationships and roles within those relationships. So for example, Ryan here finds out his girlfriend Teresa might be pregnant. It's obvious to him he has to fulfill this role as her boyfriend and the child's father, and he moves in with her to kind of help her out. In contrast, upper class contexts foster independence. So people in upper class contexts often grow up with extended family far away, move away from home for college, and maybe move a few more times as adults. So they tend to have a wider circle of looser connections with people who they see maybe a few times a year, and tend to have fewer close relationships. And they don't have such a mutual kind of network of support and aid, because they have lots of resources. They can handle things on their own. So upper class people are more likely to see themselves in terms of their own attributes and goals and interests. So like Luke here, who's just constantly cheating on his girlfriend, is focused on getting what he wants out of the relationship as opposed to kind of fulfilling a role within that relationship. So specifically, how do these daily dynamics play out differently for people with different social class backgrounds? So would someone from an upper class background just kind of ignore relationship conflicts when they occur and maybe distract themselves by focusing on their goals, like Nina? Or would someone from a lower class background maybe focus on resolving those conflicts and making sure their relationships are good, but possibly at the expense of their own personal goals, like Ella? So I was really interested in this question, and my advisor and I were able to get our hands on this data set collected by some researchers at University of Waterloo, that happened to have some measures relevant to this question. So we could do some secondary data analysis. So they had almost 300 participants, mostly students, but a few community members as well. And first they had people complete a pre-measure where they reported their household income. This is the only SES measure they have, since of course they weren't actually focused on testing our research question. But yeah, this should be kind of a red flag to be careful with trusting these results too much. It's pretty weird to measure household income among undergraduate students. And then their participants completed a daily diary survey for 28 days. So in this survey, they reported a bunch of stuff. Most relevant to our question, they reported the social events they had every day. So they reported 3 negative events: conflict or argument, annoying or irritating social situation, and then sad or bad news in a social setting. And then also 2 positive ones, so having a celebration or an enjoyable social event. And then they reported their goal progress in specific domains. so that they made progress on their professional academic goals, health fitness goals, social life, and personal development. And then finally, they reported just generally how their goal pursuit went today. So our analysis is going to follow these questions. So how do people's social events they experienced yesterday, so the day before, affect their goal pursuit today? So for example, we don't even look at their response to the first day of the diary because we don't know what happened to them the day before. And what we're really interested in is this question here. So does this differ based on income? So we might expect that for lower income people, having a negative social event might harm their goal progress, because if your relationships are really important to you, an event that threatens your relationship might take priority over your goals. Whereas for high income people, they might be better able to brush off negative social events when they occur. So what you're going to see here is income on the x-axis, and then academic professional goal pursuit on the y-axis here. And what we're interested in seeing is how people with different levels of income respond when they had more versus less negative social events yesterday. So the moderator is just the sum of all the bad things that happened to you yesterday. So you would be a 3 if you had a conflict argument and an annoying situation and bad news in a social setting. Or you'd be a 2 if you had 2 of those, 1 if you just had 1, or 0 if you didn't have any negative social events yesterday. And we're using multi-level modeling to account for the data being nested within people and within days, and then a method called the AR1 correlation structure, which accounts for autocorrelation, which just basically means dealing with the fact that people's goal pursuit today is also correlated with their goal pursuit yesterday and the day before and the day before. So what you can see here is there's a significant interaction. So for people with low incomes, experiencing a lot of negative social events yesterday is related to having worse goal pursuit today, compared to experiencing no negative social events yesterday. But for those with higher incomes, it doesn't really seem to matter how many social events they had. They're doing fine with their academic and career goals regardless. So this is kind of supporting what we thought, that people with lower incomes, if they're more focused on their relationships, that they might have a harder time focusing on their goals when those relationships are in trouble. Whereas those from higher incomes kind of ignore or brush off whatever conflicts they might be having in their social life. We also looked at to see if the same pattern emerged if we just look at whether you have any negative social event yesterday instead of kind of adding up the negative social events. And you see that same kind of pattern. So for people with lower incomes, having a conflict or bad news or something annoying predicts being less successful in pursuing your goals on the following day. So other findings, this effect is really robust. So I tried a lot of different ways of analyzing these data, like including covariates for the previous day's goal pursuit, looking at past 3 days of social events instead of yesterday, and it kind of emerges no matter what I do. It's also very similar among the students versus the non-students in this sample. And we replicated these findings in a pre-registered study that used some better measures of SES for undergrad. So for example, we measured childhood income instead of current household income. This finding is also really specific. So there's no interaction predicting the other goal domains I told you about, like health or social goals, or predicting goal pursuit in general. And there's no interaction with positive social events. So it's not that lower SES people get maybe a boost in their goal pursuit after something good happens in their social life. So just taking a step back, I think part of what's been really interesting about this project for me is to think about the ways that we navigate this tension between being socially connected to others, maintaining close ties and fulfilling our roles, but then also wanting to make our own way in the world and have our own kind of independent dreams and goals. And I think what we're doing here by trying to examine day to day how that trade-off happens and how one can influence the other is a way to see that tension play out in real life and to see how the way that you grow up affects the way you navigate that tension. So in sum, it seems that another social consequence of social class is that those from lower versus higher social class backgrounds may experience declines in goal pursuit following negative social events. And I think we're still sort of working on follow-up studies to figure out the consequences of this finding. But I think, one obvious consequence may be that those from lower income backgrounds are going to have a harder time pursuing their goals in the face of these negative social consequences. And I think another possible consequence is that those from higher incomes are going to have worse social relationships because they're not actually dedicating the time that they need in order to resolve, conflicts when they happen. So I don't have time to talk about a lot of other projects in great detail, but I just want to give you a taste of what else we're kind of currently working on and hoping to write up soon. So one project that I'm working on right now that I'm really excited about has to do with implicit stereotypes based on social class. And I think that some of this work may be able to resolve the puzzle I kind of set up for you earlier about why is it that people stereotype those with lower classes being more moral, but then people who actually are lower class don't really expect to be seen in line with that stereotype. And I think one reason may be that that's not the whole picture of how people stereotype based on social class. So what we found in this research with implicit stereotypes is the same people who will say on a self-report measure, yes, I think lower class people are more moral, actually implicitly associate low social class with lower morality. So their implicit associations are kind of backwards from what they say explicitly. So I think that maybe that means that people with lower class backgrounds go about the world experiencing sometimes people saying like, oh yeah, lower class people are so hardworking and honest, but also maybe they're lazy or they cheat the welfare system, or these, like, there are other kind of negative stereotypes to do with morality. And maybe these things come out a little bit more when people aren't thinking so much about what they're writing on a page for a research study, right? But when they're reacting really quickly. And so I think, that these explicit stereotypes don't tell us the whole story. Another project I'm working on is how social class influences how accurately we perceive each other. So like I told you earlier, we know that those from lower class backgrounds tend to have a more interdependent orientation, be more oriented towards paying attention to others. And so in some of this research that we have under review right now, we find that actually leads those lower class backgrounds to be better at understanding other people. So people from higher class backgrounds are actually perform a lot worse on tasks to do with recognizing other people's emotions. So they're less accurate when it comes to seeing a face and trying to guess what face or what emotion that face is conveying compared to people from lower class backgrounds. And so in this project, we're trying to investigate why that might be the case, and specifically how the way that you grow up versus the way that you feel now in terms of your social class could have different effects on that relationship. And then finally, we're working on another project to do with social class, investigating how social class and gender intersect. So I'm also interested in gender stereotyping, and I think there's very little, the work on intersectionality is really just starting out in psychology, and I think it's a really ripe area for future research. So we've just started this project now, looking at how social class affects how people see gender, looking at the intersectionality of social class and gender stereotypes, because I think there are a lot of differences, and a lot of the research that is done on gender stereotyping tends to focus on white, upper class or middle class women and men. But the real world is a lot more complex than that, and so I think there's a lot to be done in this area. I also just want to tell you a little bit about a somewhat different but related stream of research that I have going to do with redistribution. So one project that we're working on based on some theoretical papers that we published looks at whether observers understand how demotivating poverty can be. So there are a lot of barriers that people in poverty face just to be motivated to go to university or to try to climb that social ladder, that observers seem to think they should have that motivation. So for example, if you know that you don't have the money to go to university, then it's hard to stay motivated to get good grades in high school, for example. And so what we're looking at in this project is, do people actually understand that connection between barriers and decreased motivation? And what we find is generally they don't. And that then influences their support for redistribution. So being unwilling to redistribute resources because they assume that people in poverty are lazy because they're not, trying super hard to get good grades in high school, for example. I'll also point out that there's tons of really good examples of resilience in the face of these demotivating barriers that we see all the time in our research. But I think that people underestimate just how hard it is to be that resilient and just how much you're asking of people in poverty to just keep trying to face those barriers all the time and stay motivated in the face of them. And then another project where we're looking at has to do with the stimulus checks in the United States. So generally in the US, public support for redistribution is not unanimous. And in particular, conservatives tend to really oppose redistribution. But when the US government distributed the stimulus checks in response to COVID, there was actually really high public support among conservatives and liberals. So in this paper that we submitted, we try to figure out why that is. And the idea being that if we can figure out what it is about the stimulus checks that was really appealing to conservatives, maybe we could try to bake those features into other redistribution policies and try to get more support for them across the board. So I think the big conclusion from this work that I've been doing over the last 5 years is social class has social consequences. So someone's income, education, and occupation shapes the way that they interact socially, the way they see others, the way you're seen by others, the way they react to social situations, and probably a bunch of other outcomes we haven't thought about testing yet. But I'm looking forward to doing so. So in classic, super dramatic soap opera fashion, Ryan tells rich girl Marissa, we're from different worlds, right? And I think these worlds are actually different and more than just what their houses look like and how much money they have, but also in how they understand each other and how they interact with others. So I want to thank you all so much for inviting me and listening to this talk. This work is also really based on a lot of other people's work. So I have amazing collaborators at UPC, University of Waterloo, and at McGill. I have awesome research assistants and a fantastic supervisor, and my lab has also given great feedback on previous versions of this talk. Yeah, so thank you so much, and I'd love to hear any questions you might have.
Thank you so much, Holly. So this is time for questions. So any questions you have, you can either put in the chat or unmute yourself, whatever you think is suitable for you. I actually have one question in particular too. So I was interested in hearing more about the kind of the application of your work, because thinking about SES overall, like I'm thinking about communities that are mostly unjust and inequitable. So I'm just thinking, how would this work apply in other countries or maybe societies there is less gap when it comes to like the upper class and the lower class?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And inequality is something I haven't talked about a ton in this research, but one thing I'll say is inequality is rising in most countries around the world and is high. I mean, it's staggeringly high in the US. The research generally shows that effects of social class tend to be larger when there's more inequality, even if people have the same objective amount of resources, feeling that there's a bigger gap between you and people at the top or people at the bottom tends to exacerbate these effects and is also really bad for a lot of mental health outcomes and physical health outcomes. And I think that part of that has to do with, I didn't talk about this too much in this talk, but a lot of social class isn't just what you have objectively, but also where you feel you stand relative to others, and feeling like you're really low on the social ladder and other people have a lot of potential power over you or just have more than you, are doing better than you, and you can't quite reach that is super damaging for people's well-being. Yeah.
Other questions? It could be anything regarding school or like the PhD process journey, as well as simply the research that Holly spoke about.
Yeah, I'm definitely happy to talk about grad school and stuff. Doesn't have to be about the research for sure.
I think I'll ask one other question. So coming back to one of your, like the first studies you spoke about, when you spoke about the use of the round robin technique of like students just like turning to one another and like talking at the same exact time, I would be interested in hearing more when it comes to how did you select this particular technique? And also, generally, how do you use your methods or design your methods? And for example, that one in particular, the round robin, like how did you kind of, not saying operationalize that, but think about the reason behind it, or how would you measure what it actually symbolized?
Yeah, that's a great question. So for that one, actually, I didn't design that study. So I contacted this Professor Lauren Human, who I know does a lot of round robin research. And her stuff generally has to do with just how accurate are people's perceptions of others and meta perceptions and so on. So I contact her to just ask, like, hey, do you have any studies where you also measured income? Because I was interested in this question, and it's a ton of work to collect data on 500 people interacting each with 6 other people in the lab and rating each other. But I think that method in particular is a really good one because you get so much data from each participant. So in this study, you have one participant interacts with 6 other people, and they make 12 ratings of their meta perceptions with each of those 6 people. So we end up having, I can't do math while I know you guys are watching me, but that many observations per participant, and then 500 people. So it's just a huge wealth of data, somewhat overwhelmingly so, but it means that we can make really rich, like we have really rich, I guess, data about what each of those interactions was like. And then about your more general question in terms of methods, I wish I had more time to get into it, but for each of these, I do try to find something that works. So I spend a lot of time developing one method and really pilot testing it extensively, doing lots of small things that make it more believable for participants. And then once we have something that works, we try to stick with it and tweak it to manipulate something new or change something we think is a weakness. So for example, in the trust study I told you about, where we had people play with raffle tickets with each other, I didn't mention this, but we had all kinds of little things in that study to try to make it more believable. For example, they weren't really playing with other people, but they thought they were because the research assistants who ran the study would go into the other cubicles and give instructions, but there's not actually any participant there. So they would kind of read out the script and pretend like someone was talking to them so the participants would hear that happening. Yeah, so we try to set up very elaborate things to make it really believable and immersive. And the later trust studies that we did online with online platforms, we had them talk over instant messaging with another participant who wasn't one of the people they end up playing with, but just to give them the sense that, you know, we actually can connect you real time to another person in the study. So yeah, we try to make things that will really be believable for people. I think one weakness in the methods that we've used for a lot of these studies that I showed you is kind of what you were asking about before, which is really that these are convenience samples of people, typically from either undergrad students or on survey recruitment platforms, which is obviously really not great if what we want to study is poverty. That's not where these participants can be found. So we're trying to move a little bit away from that in my current research. I think it's just something that, like, especially as you know, as undergrad students, maybe going into grad school, potential grad students should be aware of that there are lots of incentives and norms about how to do research that you're influenced by. So my advisors wouldn't have suggested that I go out and look for participants who aren't the typical samples, for example. But I do think it's really important to do that because we all know it's a huge problem that psych research relies on these kind of samples. So lately I've been trying to do things like I ran a study where we went out just to parks and stuff around the city that we live and asked people to do our survey on iPads. And I think that that's a way more representative sample than undergrad students or people on these survey recruitment platforms, for example. But yeah, I guess just if I could do things differently, I would have realized those pressures earlier and try to maybe, like, yeah, I guess get better samples, even though it can take longer and even though it's not what the field is used to. I think that's really important, especially if you want to do research on more diverse communities. Yeah.
Can you actually speak a bit more about that when it comes to like samples and Because I think some people in the room don't know about like the weird population that
Mm,
is used in research. So if you can kind of speak a tiny bit about that to kind of give people a heads up of what it actually is, but also you being part of social psychology and like social research in that regard, what are kind of the implications of using the weird samples or actually going against it and using the samples that you, for example, just spoke about, going to parks and truly recruiting people that are could be like really could anyone could be part of your study in that regard. Anyone from the city could be part of the study.
mhm. Yeah, it's a great question. And I think this is something really, I was talking to some other undergrads at UBC about this. And I think, so the paper that you mentioned about weird samples is written by a couple other professors at UBC. So I sometimes assume that everyone knows about it because we talk about it so much, but I never heard about that in my undergrad. And so it would be totally normal if you hadn't either. Um, Basically, the idea is that psych samples are almost exclusively Western educated, industrialist, rich and democratic countries. And then even within that, it's a really small subsample of people who end up in research studies. So usually university students or middle class people now doing these online kind of survey platforms. And they, in this kind of paper where they tried to explain why this is a problem, which typically researchers in the past have just sort of said, well, they're people, so what does it matter? Actually, it matters a lot. And even the stuff that we thought was kind of a basic, like, this is how people think about things, this is how people perceive objects, for example, is really culturally bound and dependent on different cultures. So I think yeah, anyway, it's a great paper. Just Google weird research, you'll find it. It's kind of mind blowing how much different stuff they find that you would think should be just a basic kind of axiom of this is how people's brains work, because that's what I've read in all the psych papers. It's actually not true at all. And that's how college students in the US's brains work. And that's about it. So it's even a problem for more basic research like cognitive research, but I think it's a huge, massive problem for social psychology, which is, you know, the way that we think about other people and how we interact with each other. We don't realize, I think, how much this differs depending on our culture. Yeah, so I guess to me, it's really important to, especially because I'm interested in studying things like social class, it's really important that we actually try to get people who are representative in terms of social class into our studies. And that's not going to happen by just using convenient samples of undergrads. Yeah, at the same time, it can be difficult because that's what everyone does. That's where you get your participants. They're free, they don't cost money, it's very fast and easy, and they're right at your university. So I think there's a lot of reasons why, even though the field, there's a lot of papers saying we should do this, and some people are doing really excellent research using more diverse samples that are harder to find. I think it's still a lot rarer than we would want. Yeah, I don't know what the solution is to it, except that as people who consume research and are interested in it, we need to really think carefully about the samples that we're looking at and think, you know, is this research even worth reading if all of it is on undergrad students? Did the authors actually make any efforts to try to find people who are more diverse? Because if all we know about human psychology after hundreds of years of studying it is the psychology of literally undergraduate students in the US, Canada, and the UK, like, have we actually accomplished anything as a field? I'm not sure. So yeah, I mean, I do think it's really important that we try to get people from other places into our studies, and that, as you know, we read journal articles and maybe become editors or reviewers, really rewarding the research that is more costly, more difficult, more and takes longer, but is higher quality because it actually goes to the trouble of, you know, finding people from different places. Yeah, and I hope that doesn't make you totally ignore everything that I just showed you, but I actually do think that it's a huge thing to think about, and I would understand if it did. Yeah.
I appreciate you saying that, but like really thinking about how many, like how little research actually focuses on diverse populations, it will be very I don't know, not even saying ignorant, but I would say for now just ignorant, ignoring your research, what you have done, because it is still kind of part of the default, which is not the best system, but it's what has been happening. So yeah, I think this is all the time we have together. But thank you so much for joining us here, Holly. Truly, like I'm so glad you were able to do that, and I can actually hear more about your research and research that you have been doing for the past few years, and also the talks you kind of mentioned, the papers you've mentioned at the end. So thank you so much, and thank you
Thank you
everyone
for
else from
having me.
Lafayette for joining in here.
Thank you. Have a good day, everyone. Nice to